Hey, I'm Ben Bentley. I am one of Interfit's pros here in the UK, and today this video is going to be looking at the idea of utilizing strobe and ambient light together in order to create some really cool portraiture. Now, in my work, it's something I end up doing quite a lot because I shoot a lot of environmental portraits, whether that is exteriors, interiors, or otherwise. These principles are basically at the center of my workflow. So the first question, for some people at least, might be, well, why would I want to combine those two things? Ambient is ambient, flash is flash. Well, ultimately, it's about being able to create something that is bigger than the sum of its parts. Now, what is cool about that is that you are creating something that somebody can't physically see. You're elevating something beyond what the naked eye is able to perceive. Now, in that case, it can be a stylistic choice, but it can also be a really practical choice depending as to what the weather is doing, depending as to what the available light in any given room is doing. Now, to get us off the ground with this and to get us started, the principles that we really need to keep in mind on a technical level are that your aperture setting is going to control the amount of flash that is ultimately able to enter the camera, and your shutter speed is going to allow you to control the ambient light which is entering the sensor. And between those two things and the balancing act that you are going to create within the camera is going to allow you to create the overall lighting for your image. Now, ISO in this situation is simply a gate. That is almost like a master control switch in terms of the overall sensitivity. So my starting point would always be to pick an ISO initially, but you might end up choosing a different one, a higher one or a lower one, depending as to whether or not you can dial in the ambient exposure using your shutter speed that you're hoping to achieve. In the first example that I'm going to show you guys today, this is a shoot from back in March, actually, for an Interfit campaign, literally right before the world got very, very different very quickly. We were shooting in Birmingham in the Jewellery Quarter, and we were utilising the Interfit Honey Badger Unleashed, which is the 250 watt monolight lithium battery. Great for location shooting, and we're using I think it's a 120 centimeter pop-up softbox. So it's a one light setup, but I'm essentially using my Honey Badger as my key light because it's directional and I'm able to control that. And then I'm utilizing the overcast day that we were dealing with in order to behave as fill light. In this first setup, we've got this great leather jacket. Now, what I was fascinated by as soon as I saw our model start to move is that we were getting actual movement on the tassels. Now, I very quickly decided I wanted to freeze that. So the role of my flash in this scenario was going to be exactly that. It was going to be freezing the action in camera. So first step, I choose an ambient exposure for the daylight that is available. Now, in this situation, I wanted to expose it probably half a stop to one stop under what the actual value would be. So using my camera's meter, I dialed that in and eyeballed it, as I do most of these things, in order to get it to a point where I thought that looked about right for a starting point. We can always come back to that and dial it in one way or the other. We can either bring it further underexposed or we can bump it up a little bit further, but initially it was looking pretty good, and I decided that that was when I wanted to incorporate the flash and see what we were dealing with. So at this point in time, my exposure was, I think, f4, 250th of a second. So I set my strobe initially to half power, and then I upped it from there to get it to the point at which I was comfortable with it once I had positioned it. Now, as we move along a little bit, I decide to change my setting, so I'm no longer using a background texture in the open shade that we found, and I am now instead using the skyline and the actual daylight as part of my scene. So in this case, I needed to actually increase my shutter speed in order to get the exposure for the background that I was looking for. So I activated the strobe and my camera's high-speed sync mode by pushing the shutter over the native inbuilt flash sync speed of 250th of a second. Now, this instead means that I can shoot all the way through my camera's full shutter range. So in this case, on the camera body that I'm using, that would be 1/4000th of a second. So now at this point, I think we're somewhere around the 2000th of a second mark. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my aperture up in order to utilize the high-speed sync mode on the flash and to allow that flash power to give me a relative exposure that is going to allow us to key light the subject the way in which that we're hoping to. And as you can see here, you end up with a slightly more dramatic result. And what I can do is I can lean the shutter either lower or higher to exaggerate or to loosen that effect of the key light situation. So the second example of combining ambient and strobe would be an interior setup. Now, a lot of the locations that I shoot in have some really great interior design, and for the most part, I try and incorporate that into what I'm actually shooting. Now, it's really important to me that if there is a distinct vibe and a mood to the environment, and that is part of the story that we're telling, then that does need to be there. So what I look to do is I look to find an ambient exposure initially as a starting point that is going to allow me to present that as part of this story. In these situations, I don't really want to overpower the ambient light. I also want to complement it and use my strobe more so as, I guess, a directional fill light almost, to ensure I'm getting the quality of light that I'm looking for on my subject, but without compromising the vibe that the ambient light gives to the room, whether that's from the type of lighting or whether that's from the big open window. But it just allows me to work in a way in which I am not dictated solely by that. There is nothing wrong with that, but for a lot of the work that I'm producing, I need the flexibility of ultimately being able to control where my key light is coming from and how powerful my key light is in relationship to the rest of the environment that we're working in. So again, I set a base exposure for the ambient light in the room. Now, in this situation, what I may end up doing is I may end up either going onto a tripod and opening up my shutter lower than my focal length, or I may end up bumping the ISO, so whereby which I can still shoot handheld, but I'm increasing the sensitivity of the sensor overall and subsequently adjusting my ratio of all of these power settings. Now, either way is absolutely fine, and I shoot handheld a lot because, to be honest, I find tripods quite restrictive in a lot of situations, and it definitely slows down my workflow in scenarios whereby which I'm having to be very conscious of time. If I only have access to my subject for however long, I want to utilize that time as best as possible. And for me personally, shooting on a tripod often dictates that, and it dictates the speed, which I don't particularly like. So where I can, I will shoot at an ISO that I know is still going to give me clean enough images for the purpose that I'm wanting to do, but I'm also aware that I can, like I said, adjust that ratio of that exposure triangle in order to give me what I'm wanting in camera as best as possible. Thanks for joining us for this. This has obviously been wildly different to what we imagined the photography show was going to look like this year. So if there are any questions, then by all means, feel free to hit me up or the Interfit guys. I am at Ben Bentley Photo on Twitter and on Instagram, and they are at Interfit Photo UK on all the usual social platforms as well. So until next time, take care. I hope you have fun with these techniques, and I'm excited to see what you guys come up with.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name's Joe. I'm from Interfit. We're here with Ben Bentley, who you probably just saw on the video there. We're just going to go straight into a few questions that have come in during the video, just to sort of get the ball rolling. So Ben, first of all, one of the questions that came in is, you never seem to use a light meter. Should we start, and why is that?
Okie dokie. Well, good morning, and thank you to everybody for joining us and watching the video. So that's a good question actually, and that's one that sort of people ask fairly routinely. I don't even own a light meter actually. I did at one point, but it's kind of a tricky question. So obviously there is nothing wrong with using one, but to be perfectly honest, I think if you have got a solid understanding of how a manual exposure for any given image works, in principle, getting used to using flash in conjunction with a manual exposure, doing that the hard way, as it were, is going to give you a kind of a set of tools really to sort of actually work in a little bit more of an advanced way in any given circumstance. A light meter is going to give you sort of the academic, scientific values based on what you're telling it, but it's not ultimately a creative tool. It's one of those things which is kind of going to get you into a ballpark, and certainly will give you an exposure that works. But in a situation like this, where we're talking about mixing strobe with ambient light to create something that combines the two and is a product of the two, I don't know whether or not a flash meter is necessarily like I said, a tool that is going to yield you with a creative result rather than simply a result that is properly exposed. Does that make sense?
No, I see what you mean. I mean, I think for me personally, I think light meters, they have a habit of being a bit, they're for back in film days. I used to use a light meter the most, but now obviously you've got light meters built into your camera. You've got live review. So, like you say, if you wanted to know exactly how much light is being kicked out, and because you need to do like a scientific reason, so you can set the exact same shot up again in a fixed controlled area, then there's reasons for it. But I can't
absolutely. I kind of, in some ways, I would almost liken it to sort of the kind of settings that aperture priority or shutter priority might give you. In that it technically is an exposure that is going to give you some settings for a certain environment, but it's not necessarily taking into account any of the decisions that you as an individual are making. And I think it's so easy to end up kind of ignoring the part that you do play, because obviously the gear is important and the gear is the tool that is going to let you ultimately do what you're going to do. But it's so easy to kind of, to reduce the input of the individual and those choices that you're making. Because obviously a shot that is at f1.4 at 5,000th of a second is going to look a lot different in terms of a flash exposure to a shot that's at f16 at 200th of a second, right? Like and how you want that frame to look ultimately is what needs to make that decision for you, not simply just a digital reading based on the science. So like I said, it's a tool that definitely gets a lot of people started, but in some ways, I don't know, I could see how it could be easy to become reliant upon that, and that just becomes your entire workflow. But at the same time, I do understand that it is nerve-wracking for some people, especially early on, when you have got somebody sat in front of you and you potentially don't have them for too long. You want to sort of get up and running as quickly as possible. So in those situations, I would just urge you to test before the person is sat there and just take that pressure off yourself, really, if possible. Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. Preparation and everything, right?
All right, so moving on to portraiture, it says that you talked about starting photography life as a music sort of photographer. How did you segue into sort of portraiture and the sort of setups that you showed in the video?
Yeah, so I mean, it's less of a segue and kind of more of a natural evolution, because I do still shoot some live music. That still is can be an element of the assignments that I shoot. But to be honest, the portraiture kind of was an addition to that, based on sort of telling the overall kind of story of those situations. Like as time was going on, I was getting asked to shoot portraits of bands backstage, either before the show or after the show, or it was kind of, I would meet people and eventually they would need press shots and whatnot. And and all of a sudden I was being confronted with the idea of having to photograph people in a posed fashion. So it was more of an evolution, really. But what I did realize was that, having kind of cut my teeth in a live music environment where you cannot control the circumstances, you cannot control the lighting, you have to genuinely tell the story with the tools, the raw ingredients that are in front of you, I did realize that by the time I started to shoot portraits and I was starting to want to light them, the flexibility that gave me was really, really refreshing. And they sat quite nicely together in that one was kind of unbridled chaos, and the other actually allowed me to sort of, do you know what I mean, like to actually have
take a bit of
some
control
say over. Yeah. So between those two things, I think they really rounded me out in terms of a skill set as a photographer, right? In terms of thinking about utilizing the light that was there, but also potentially, I mean, that was probably the first time I ever mixed flash with ambient light, would have been in a live music setting. And ultimately that same principle of filling with ambient light or overpowering ambient light with flash, that was all born out of shooting live music. Cool. So the two aren't as far apart as you might think, because it's all part and parcel of whatever the story is that you're trying to convey, right? And it's it's like I said, more of an evolution than it was a sort of a segue, as it were, because some people would pin themselves into a box as being one of those two things, but no, I'm a photographer who happens to shoot music and also shoots portraiture. It's not, those two things aren't exclusive. And I do find that odd, especially when I see people either following me or writing to me or whatever, and they pigeonhole themselves as that one specific thing, and it's kind of each to their own, obviously, but to me, it was all just part and parcel of how I tell these stories that surround these characters who happen to be in music at that point. Cool. But obviously, those principles apply to whoever steps in front of my camera.
So what you're basically saying is that it's the full round package. You photograph them either before they go on stage and then when they're on stage, and it allows you to to sort of hit it from both angles, really, doesn't it? There's that sort of
for sure. Like it's about providing more of a comprehensive story, and that really sort of happened in a big way when I started working for the NME, and all of a sudden it wasn't just getting sent to shoot a live show, it was shooting sort of a posed lit portrait of the band to accompany them for the feature or whatever, and the world kind of opened up to me at that point, and I got really excited about portraiture because, like I said, having spent so long not being in control of sort of the lighting and the circumstances and desperately trying to craft something from what was given to me, the opportunity to then actually build something of my own and to present these people in a way that I wanted to was really, really exciting. And then obviously to see those images sit together in conjunction in a magazine spread is kind of is really, really exciting.
Okay, cool. Right, so we've got other questions come in. So what's the minimum wattage you feel you could use outdoors? With something like a Godox V1 would be powerful enough. Chris, who sent that message in. So I'm assuming the Godox V1 is around 75 to 100 watts. That tends to be speed light, sort of, sort of power.
So I'll throw my hands up and say I am not familiar with any of the Godox line, but no, in terms of power for flash outside, regardless of brand, I mean, power is power, right? Regardless of brand, I would ask you just to be realistic about what you're intending to do with that, because obviously a 75 to 100 watt light is going to be of no use to you if you're trying to overpower the midday sun. But at the same time, that's not to say that a 75 watt light couldn't be used outside. I mean, you've got to figure out sort of, okay, is there some available shade that I can utilize, and then subsequently, your exposure is relative to that. So so if the question translates to what kind of power do I need to overcompensate for the sun, I would probably say, in realistic terms, you are looking at 500 watts and above in order to do that efficiently, but in a high speed sync kind of sense. But no, if you're simply wanting to get outside potentially later in the day, or sort of during the day, but sort of in what we call open shade or available shade, then by all means, I think if you can get a 75 watt light pretty close to your subject, you're totally going to be able to use that. And again, I think if you're getting started with with shooting portraits outside on location, I would say, yeah, maybe don't go all in and buy a ton of huge lights and whatever. I would kind of work up to that and just figure out what it is that you actually enjoy doing with them. And I mean, ultimately, what you want to create you've got to work backwards from there. So I'm seeing here that Chris said, would that be powerful to achieve a professional look? So if by professional look you're meaning high-speed sync, overpowering the midday sun, and creating a really bold, dramatic shot, then yeah, power is the door to that, basically, because without that you're going to struggle, because whether you're doing high-speed sync or whether or not you're going to just do sort of Sunny 16 or f22 or whatever, you still need power to be able to achieve that kind of exposure.
So what you're basically saying is it depends on the situation. Obviously a 75 watt speed light can do a good job in one situation, but in another situation, then potentially it may struggle. So Chris, I think what Ben's basically saying is that when Ben said that you've got to see the shot you want, you've got to work backwards from it. I think that's the best way to do that. It's just to sort of like you plan your stuff, your images thoroughly, and sort of say, what do I need to achieve this, and then sort of go out and investigate from there. Sadly, I mean, with Flash, I think Ben will agree, there's not one light that will do everything. If you understand, if you're looking at sort of running and gunning with the speed light versus a six light setup in a desert somewhere, they are very, very different sort of images you're trying to create there.
I mean, I think anything more than 500 watts at this point, you're looking at having to carry a separate power pack with you, which all of a sudden becomes a totally different animal altogether. And I mean, I've said this before at various points, but before I was using the Interfit strobes, I was using an older Bowen setup, and one of the biggest continuing pains in my rear was that the travel packs were just genuinely heavy. They were like carrying car batteries around with you. So on average, I was running probably 2 or 3 heads at most off of one of those travel packs. And if I was shooting 5 or 6 lights, like Joe just said, that's 2 or 3 of those car battery size power packs that I was having to cart around with me. And in all honesty, there was some fairly sort of short and sweet assignments that I was still having to hire my assistant for the day just for the sake of carrying the power packs. I didn't actually necessarily need their help in a 15-minute shoot in a hotel room or whatever, but it was more so just literally being able to move those kind of huge batteries. So the thing I ended up really falling in love with the Interfit S1 strobe was just the fact that I had genuinely enough power to work with outdoors with a built-in lithium battery. So it's one thing saying, okay, I'm carrying some spare batteries, but again, they're much smaller and much lighter and far less inconvenient to carry around than, like I said, than a travel pack, which was the size of the car battery. So this is another reason why I would urge people not to just necessarily dive in at the deep end and buy a ton of gear, because over time you've kind of got to see in real time and from your own experiences what you actually do need to do what you're wanting to do. There is a tendency and a habit, I guess, for people to simply go all in, and they feel very enthusiastic about it, and then you end up getting lumped with a house full of equipment that you use a quarter of, right? So I'm a big sort of fan in sort of building up a kit that can eventually serve your purposes rather than you serving the gear that you've got, because there are always going to be those people who insist on dragging the kitchen sink with them just because they've got it, and that's not a clean way of working. And over time I've really come to appreciate that. The more pre-production you can do and planning and trying to sort of just get your head around what it is you're hoping to achieve, it just allows you to pack a little bit more sensibly. And ultimately, if you can forget about that side of things, you can actually focus on creating some great imagery if you're confident in the equipment that you're using. But no, honestly, I mean, I think for the price point and for what it offers, yeah, even though it's a couple of years old now, that the S1 as a 500-watt monolight is still, hand on heart, yeah, honestly, a lot of bang for your buck, especially if you are genuinely trying to work outdoors and sort of you're wanting to have a fighting chance at overpowering actual daylight.
All right, brilliant. Thanks for that, Ben. So we've got another question here. So what is the most important element of a great location portrait to you, that is? What do you think it is?
So for me, it always comes back to story, because we can talk about equipment until we're blue in the face, but having all of the gear in the world does not guarantee you a decent portrait, right? So my question would be, okay, is what I am doing here technically, is this allowing me to tell the story that I'm trying to tell? Is this allowing me to present my subject in the fashion that I'm trying to, right? So for me, like I said in the video, one of the really exciting things about mixing strobe with ambient light is that you're creating something that is actually above and beyond what the naked eye is seeing at that point. The way I am able to present somebody at that point feels more cinematic. It feels like I am showing you them in this very specific fashion, and that to me is what is exciting, is if whatever you're evoking, whatever story you're trying to tell, that has to be the pillar of that portrait. You could look at it and say that's a great exposure, but if the story isn't there and the person isn't engaged and you're not conveying whatever the message is you're trying to convey, then you've not succeeded at that point. So yeah, for me, it's always going to boil down to, okay, am I effectively telling this story that I'm trying to tell? And everything has to work backwards from there. And you'll hear me say that all the time. Everything has to be reverse engineered from what it is you're wanting to achieve. And that doesn't mean that you've got to walk into a situation and be able to create the image that is in your head, but you've got to have a firm idea of overall what you're looking for, while still being open to the idea that there are always going to be things that do present themselves on the day, right? I'm big into the idea of sort of, taking opportunities or varying things based on situations that you couldn't possibly have anticipated. But at the same time, you're only in a comfortable position to do that if you are going into it with the confidence of what you wanted to at least definitely achieve, if that makes sense. You've got to get whatever is in your head out of your head in order to then be able to do the potentially even more creative, spontaneous stuff, I guess.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so again, it's just read, preparation is key. Reverse engineer, making sure that you know how to get the image from your head onto the back of the camera, and how you're going to do that, basically. All right, cool. So we've got another question as well. It says, what white balance settings do you use?
So it kind of depends. So if I'm strictly using flash, and flash is my dominant is my key light at that point rather than a fill, I will usually set my camera to the flash temperature, so to 5500 Kelvin. But to be honest, I mean, I shoot in RAW, and it doesn't really, obviously it doesn't really matter at that point, because that can be adjusted. But what I do find is, if I'm shooting on set and the client is present, or there is management of whoever I'm photographing present, and I'm shooting tethered into my laptop, it kind of helps to show them an image that is white balanced and presents the skin tone at an accurate sort of temperature and things like that. So it's not so much for me in camera, because obviously it takes all of 2 seconds to white balance something out in with a raw file, but more so it ends up being for the people who are potentially observing and seeing what that looks like. What I will say is, if I am blending flash and ambient light, obviously my actual white balance value for skin tones at that point will vary. It's not going to necessarily be that perfect sweet spot of 5,000 to 6,000 Kelvin. So in that case, that is the situation where, again, if I've got somebody looking over my shoulder, as it were, at the screen or at my monitor, then I will potentially, that is a situation where I will dial in a value which would look, about right. But to be perfectly honest, for most people, especially if you're getting going with this stuff, white balance is one of those things that I wouldn't speak out about in the moment when you're actually on set with somebody in front of your camera, because ultimately, like I said, if you're shooting raw files, you've not got anything to worry about at that point. It's one of the few times that I would advocate somebody using an automatic setting on a camera, because at this point in time, most modern Nikons, Canons, Sonys, Fujis, whatever, their algorithm for figuring out white balance is pretty clever at this point. It will definitely get you into a ballpark. Like I said, it's only if you are really mixing those two light sources, whether it's available light and it's daylight, or if it's the available light from other light sources in a room, that's the only time that I would really be sort of starting to dial that in order to get it to sort of, how I envisage that looking, or whatever.
So at any stage, would you take do a custom white balance setting, use a grey card or anything like that, or would you just sort of try and do it all by eye?
So sometimes it's by eye, because like I said, depending as to which combination of light sources you are, that you are combining, right? Because the grey card is only going to give you the value for the light source that is predominantly hitting it. So the issue there is that value is still only relative to one of potentially 2, 3, or more light sources in that room. So when I say about using your eye, you're just looking for a global setting that looks as though it is in the world of what you want. But like I said, all of this is predicated on shooting raw, so you can still dial that in. That is, white balance is one of those few things at this point that you can't really particularly screw up, providing you are shooting in raw. So but no, if I'm shooting something if I'm doing like a white seamless kind of setup, then for the most part, I will be using a grey card for that, because at that point, then I know that flash is usually my dominant light source in that situation. So therefore I can have those values. And equally, a color passport is handy if you are definitely trying to sort of recreate certain color values. If I'm working on potentially something more commercially orientated, and there is product involved, it is obviously very important from a client perspective that color is represented, and it's so much easier to nail that, like it is a lot of these things, to nail it in camera and give yourself a fighting chance, or give your retoucher a fighting chance when it comes to actually nailing actual color values. But that's obviously a little bit different to to sort of just finding a white balance that works for skin tone.
So I think that the take home from that is that the white balances in RAW is so adjustable that you're not fixed to any one particular setting, and if in doubt, get the grey card out. Is that what you're saying, sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. That's cool. That's it.
All right, great stuff. So there is another question here. It says, what modifiers and kit do you choose, and how do you make that decision?
So that is a good question, and that's one that people sort of quite often ask me, actually. So I think, again, and this has been the response to a lot of these questions, you've got to work backwards from what it is you're wanting to achieve, or you're hoping to achieve. So I know for a fact that if I'm going to go for something that's very soft lit, and I'm going to have some pretty good proximity on my subjects with the light source, I know for a fact I'm probably going to take one of my parabolic umbrellas with the diffusion, but I also know that I'm probably going to take one of my octoboxes and take a grid, so I can really control that fall off. So like I said, all of those decisions are kind of born out of having some idea in your mind, at least, of what you would like to create. Whether that ends up being what you do ultimately create, obviously, there's a lot of other factors involved in that. But I definitely have gone through periods of the kitchen sink approach, whereby which I maybe know one of the setups or two of the setups that we're going to do, but there is always that niggle of, oh, well, what if you want to have the tools available to you to do that? So at the moment, my basic go-to, if I'm doing, say, anything between a 2 and a 4 light setup, would be to have 2 octoboxes that both have grids. I would have one parabolic umbrella with diffusion, And then I would also probably take a beauty dish and or a zoom reflector, so I can do a nice hard option, as well as obviously facilitating the soft light with the bigger modifiers. So between those four things, I mean, or three products really for the most part. Yeah, a parabolic umbrella, which would be a bounce back rather than a shoot through, a mid-size octobox, so somewhere between 3 and 4 feet, a beauty dish, and then a zoom reflector. Those are kind of the meat and vegetables of what I do and what a lot of people do, to be honest. And after that point, it's about how you're utilizing those. The other thing that I would say is very handy, and it doesn't really get talked about enough, really. I've got this great 6 foot by 6 foot collapsible scrim that Interfit makes. So it's essentially a collapsible frame with a sheet of I think it's 1.5 stop white diffusion, and basically outdoors, this kind of comes back to one of the questions we were talking about earlier, really. If I don't necessarily have open shade that I can utilize, and I am wanting to just control that a little bit more rather than strictly having to overpower the sun entirely with pure wattage, it can just give me that little bit of wiggle room. Like I said, it gives me that stop or stop and a half extra diffusion in order to sort of, to just control how the daylight is infiltrating. And there's been quite a few situations where, especially middle of the day, middle of the afternoon, that has really helped me. Particularly if you are somewhere where it is very, very open and you haven't got the shade of buildings or structures or trees or whatever to sort of to kind of work with. So that would probably be the fourth or the fifth sort of modifier I would add to that list. But again, I know people shy away from them because they're not hugely practical, but like I said, the collapsible one that I've got probably folds down to sort of it folds down to less than 6 feet long, and it's in a pretty narrow sort of carry bag. So it's one of those ones that will be a little bit of a bear to have to take with you. The options it gives you, a second to none. There's never a time I've taken it with me and I wished I didn't, put it that way.
Okay. Cool. Right, so we've got a bit short of time, and just hopefully that's covered the answer there. We've just got a couple more questions that have come in. So just got a really quick question. What are your top tips for posing subjects on photo shoots?
Right, so unsurprisingly, I'm going to start with what is it you're ultimately trying to achieve, right? So sometimes, depending as to what kind of image this is, what the purpose of this image is that is always going to dictate how I approach this. Because at the end of the day, if I have been booked to shoot a portrait of somebody specific in the sense that they are an entity in their own right, they're an actor, a musician, a person of note or whatever, the story I am telling is their story at that point. Now, although I don't want them to look odd in an awkward sense, I still need their character to come through, right? There is no point in me posing somebody and making them look like a model if they aren't a model and that's not the context. Does that make sense? Because I see that quite a lot. I see pictures of politicians all the time who have been posed as if they're in GQ, when in reality that isn't. Do you know what I mean? Like, that isn't.
It's not who they are.
You are then presenting a version of that as opposed to. And I don't mean this like in a photojournalistic sense. I'm not saying it has to be candid and sincere and whatever, but in certain situations, I just try and modify somebody's existing tendencies into being more presentable, if that makes sense, rather than sort of doing the step one, step two, this arm here, this arm. Do you know what I mean? Like, I need their character to shine through. And early on, I definitely had a couple of moments where I looked back at shots and I was like, there is more of me and how I have posed this person coming through. No, and honestly, and it's a natural course of learning and progressing. But that being said, though, if I'm working with people who have no experience of being in front of the camera, it is important to have sort of a set of, I don't know, sensibilities or whatever that you can give somebody and coach somebody with in order to get them to present a version of themselves that they're happy with. So it's kind of, it's a tricky balance between those two, really.
So I think a conversation with the subject beforehand maybe
For
show some
sure, that's it.
examples.
And
Yeah, just get to know the person a little bit. I mean, I know it's not always the case if you've turned up, but I'm sure like a couple of minutes, 10 minutes before the shoot, just to sort of say, you know, listen, this is my
that's
thoughts.
totally
Try
it.
and get a bit of character out of them. Okay, cool. Right, so we'll have to end it there, guys. Oh, sorry, Ben, go on.
Oh, sorry. Have we run out of time? I was gonna say my
We have
very
a little
last
bit,
thought
but go on.
my very last thought would be, to be honest, if you can nail down the technical side of things and you can know confidently in your mind that you can expose this shot, you can position these lights, and you can create this setup, that needs to be in the back of your mind, because when I'm on set, I would rather be concentrating on even spending 2 minutes or 90 seconds or whatever developing some sort of rapport, in the vain hope that what you're getting out of that subject is something above and beyond what the next person or the person before you got. So honestly, that's the biggest piece of advice, is to get comfortable with the technical and to be confident in your skill set in that sense, so you can literally park that in the back of your mind and you can actually focus on being creative and interesting in terms of what you as an individual are bringing to the mix and to the table. But yeah, I know we've run out of time, so yeah, I'll stop rambling there.
Great stuff. So just a quick one, guys, for anyone's interested. Neuro Imaging is another one of our Interfit ambassadors. He's doing a behind the scenes video and talk on a photo shoot she did at Tank Space in Nottingham, which is an underwater photographic facility. It's tomorrow at 10, so feel free to tune in. You can, again, it's a similar setup. You can ask some questions and see how it works. So, well, anyway, thanks for your time. Thanks for joining us on Saturday morning.
You guys. Really appreciate it.
I hope everyone enjoyed, maybe learned something. So all the best. Enjoy the rest of the weekend, everyone. Thanks a lot.
See you later. Take care.